Great. Good morning. I'm Lori Lowell, the Executive Director of Home Haven, and this program is presented to you by the Health and Wellness Committee. And ordinarily, Pat Allen would be doing the introduction, but she's away. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Ruddle, who will be presenting Inflammation, Friend or Foe. And I want to tell you a little bit about her. Nancy Ruddle was born in St. Louis, grew up in New Jersey, obtained her BA from Mount Holyoke College and her PhD from Yale University. She was a faculty member in immunobiology at Yale Medical School and the Yale School of Public Health, where she is the John Rodman Paul Professor Emerita. Dr. Ruddle's research interests are in autoimmune diseases, mechanisms of inflammation, and lymphoid organ development. So you can see she's an expert in what she's presenting on. She is the recipient of many honors, including the 2021 Medal of Science from the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering. She and her husband, the late Frank Ruddle of blessed memory, were among the founding members of Home Haven, where she is a longtime member of the Health and Wellness Committee and East Rock Village. So thank you, Nancy, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, lovely to be here with you all. Hopefully this is going to go okay. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about inflammation, and just a minute, I have to get rid of you all up here. Okay, so originally, of course, I was supposed to speak in May, and then September 12th. Just a minute, my animations aren't working. There we go. But that didn't work. So here I am on October 25th, and I hope you bear with me because I'm still a little congested from rather mild experience with COVID. So today we're going to talk about inflammation, and we're going to talk about whether it's a friend, that is, whether it's beneficial, or whether it's a foe, that is it detrimental? So we're going to talk about all the many different kinds of inflammation. There are acute kinds of inflammation, such as a local inflammation, which would be like an infected finger, a systemic inflammation, which would be something like septic shock, and inflammation can be chronic and local in an autoimmune disease, such as type 1 diabetes, where only the pancreas is affected, or it can be systemic, again, such as cardiovascular disease. So I'm going to give you many examples of beneficial and detrimental inflammation, and I'm going to talk about how it happens and how can we regulate it. So this is what your skin would look like if you put it under a microscope. So up at the top, we see the layers of skin, that's called the dermis. And then down here, we have a blood vessel. And in that blood vessel are red blood cells and white blood cells. And when a pathogen, that is when, say, we have a thorn or something that penetrates the skin, bacteria enter into the skin. And as a result, there are signals that result in telling the immune system that danger has occurred. And as a result of that danger, the immune system responds by producing factors that are called cytokines. And these cytokines are molecules that communicate through the immune system and tell the immune system that something very bad has happened. And as a result of that, the blood cells in the white blood cells in the blood vessel leave the blood vessel because the blood vessel becomes permeable because of the cytokines. And the white blood cells leave the blood vessel and go into the site of the bacteria. And there they destroy the bacteria. And as a result, the bacteria, that inflammation will eventually resolve. But initially, there's pain, swelling, and redness. And so that's a detrimental effect of the inflammation. That is, it's very painful. The beneficial part of the inflammation is that the bacteria have been destroyed. Another beneficial aspect of this inflammation is that an immune response is initiated. So what happens is some of these white blood cells that have attacked the bacteria take the bacteria to our lymph nodes, and there they set up an immune response. So an important aspect of inflammation is its ability to initiate an immune response. And that doesn't happen unless one of these danger signals is apparent. So again, here we have a beneficial form of inflammation. So these are the cardinal signs of inflammation. And in fact, these appear to be very distressing: pain, heat, redness, swelling, and loss of function. So inflammation is caused by white blood cells, that is, those cells that are in the bloodstream, and their products, which I mentioned before, which are called cytokines. And I'll tell you a bit more about what cytokines are. But there are many different kinds of white blood cells. These include macrophages, which can ingest the bacteria and destroy them, dendritic cells, which take the bacteria to the lymph node and set up an immune response, and then lymphocytes such as T cells and B cells, which respond to the assault. And these are just a few of cells of the immune system and their products. So B cells are important because they make antibody. T cells make cytokines, as do B cells, and macrophages, which can ingest the bacteria and destroy them, also make cytokines. So what are cytokines? So cytokines are products of immune cells that tell other cells what to do. So they're kind of messengers from one cell to another. And the word cytokine comes from the Greek cyto, cell, kine, to set in motion. There are over 200 cytokines. And I'm not going to tell you about every single cytokine, but we're going to concentrate on a few. The pro-inflammatory cytokines include TNF, IL-1, and IL-6, and many other cytokines. IL-1 is particularly important because it causes fever. And fever may be somewhat distressing to someone who has a bacterial or viral infection. But in fact, fever is very important because it kind of revs up the immune system. The immune system works better under conditions of high temperature. Then the immune system has some anti-inflammatory cytokines, that is, cytokines that can dampen down the immune response. Then there are cytokines that are antiviral, and these are called interferons. And then ones that activate macrophages and activate those T cells and activate B cells so they can make antibodies. So cytokines are absolutely crucial in the proper functioning of the immune response. So here's another example of an immune response that's beneficial. And in this slide, we see a section of a brain, and this individual, unfortunately, has a tumor called a glioma that is in the brain. But the immune response responds to that glioma by causing inflammation. And this inflammation is a very special kind of inflammation called a tertiary lymphoid structure. And this inflammation becomes very organized and looks very much like what a lymph node looks like. So it's a very organized structure and is capable of reacting to the glioma. And these tertiary lymphoid structures are seen in many kinds of chronic inflammation. These tertiary lymphoid structures, these organized inflammation, have been shown to be beneficial in cancer. For example, an individual with breast cancer who has tertiary lymphoid structures has a much better chance of survival and of cancer-free survival. These tertiary lymphoid structures are also very important in immunotherapy, which is a major field now in oncology. So here is a summary of some of these beneficial aspects of inflammation. So I've told you that they can clear infections such as bacteria, viruses, and fungi. The fever revs up the immune system. Inflammation is required for immunization for vaccines. So when you are immunized with, say, a COVID-19 vaccine, there's actually material in that vaccine that causes inflammation and that causes the immune response to respond to the vaccine itself. And as I've mentioned, inflammation is an important defense against tumors. However, inflammation can also be harmful. For example, in acute inflammation, such as systemic sepsis, an overwhelming bacterial infection is very damaging and can be fatal. Acute inflammation causes what's called a cytokine storm in COVID-19. In allergy, your body is reacting against the environment and causes inflammation. And in autoimmunity, such as multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, your body is reacting against itself in chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation can affect multiple organs in cardiovascular disease, neurological disease, autoimmunity, etc. So here's an example of acute systemic inflammation, which is harmful. That is bacterial sepsis. So these are some of the symptoms of sepsis, which can be fatal. So a fast heart rate, low blood pressure, fever, shaking, chills, confusion, a rash, extreme pain, extreme discomfort. And these are some of the hallmarks of sepsis. You shiver, you have extreme pain, pale or discolored skin, you're sleepy, you feel like you might die, and you're short of breath. I myself have actually had a bout of sepsis, and I can tell you it's not fun. And sepsis is due to an overactive immune response with high levels of cytokines that, instead of just being local, which is the way they usually are systemic. That is, they're in the bloodstream and they're throughout your body. This is another example of high levels of cytokine. That is a systemic cytokine storm in COVID-19. So this is the kind of a response that we heard about early on in the pandemic, before people had vaccines or before there were kind of herd immunity, with a lot of people already having responded to COVID-19. So the first thing that happens is we're infected with SARS-CoV-2. And the first thing that first response to that is actually an antiviral cytokine, interferon. So that's a beneficial cytokine that is trying to inhibit the virus replication. Unfortunately, sometimes that interferon is not effective enough, and there's damage to the lung epithelial cells. And now cytokines start being produced to try to respond to that. IL-1 causing fever, TNF causing inflammation, causing lots of cells to enter into the lung, that is T cells and all these other kinds of white blood cells. And they respond by making even more cytokines, such as TNF and interferon, which are inflammatory cytokines. This is called a cytokine storm, with high fever and a response that's almost like sepsis. And as a result of all of these cytokines, there's something called a vascular leak. That is, your blood vessels are leaky, and clots form, and then many, many organs are affected, with multi-organ failure and death. So this is an example where the immune response is trying very hard to respond to an insult, that is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but it's overreacting and it's out of control. It's another example of a detrimental inflammation are allergic reactions. And there are many, many things that can cause allergy in different people. These include poison ivy, animal scratches, jewelry, such a bee sting, food allergies, and inhalation, pollen, dust, etc. And in all of these symptoms, and in all of these insults, the symptoms are actually due to inflammation. So the rash is due to inflammation in your skin. The runny nose and runny eyes are due to a kind of white blood cell called a mast cell that is causing release of histamine. So all of these are inflammation and distressing. Another kind of chronic inflammation in autoimmunity is rheumatoid arthritis. And in rheumatoid arthritis, the joints are inflamed. And each of these joints has a kind of inflammation that looks very much like that tertiary lymphoid organ that I told you about before. And rheumatoid arthritis can be distinguished from osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis is due to kind of wear and tear on the joints, where the bone ends rub together. And there is some inflammation, but not to the extent that there is in rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease in which we are reacting against our own self-proteins. And what happens is that there's inflammation at the joint, and the bone is eroded or destroyed. And what we see, again, if we look at a section or a histology under a microscope in the joint in rheumatoid arthritis, is we see inflammation, a lot of cytokines, including TNF, which we'll talk about in a minute, and lots and lots of inflammation. So this bone erosion, this bone damage, is caused by the cells coming into the joint. So in summary, there are many different kinds of inflammation. We talked about acute inflammation, such as an allergic reaction. And some of this inflammation can be caused by a cut, like I told you before, where a thorn injects some bacteria, but they can also be caused just by trauma or burn or other kinds of infection or chemical irritants. On the other hand, there's also chronic inflammation like cardiovascular disease, rheumatoid arthritis, other autoimmune diseases. Neurologic diseases can be associated with inflammation and cancer. And of course, in cancer, I mentioned that inflammation can be good for you. So here's a gentleman who's looking, I think, unusually happy, where he is exhibiting many different kinds of inflammation. And the point of this slide is to show you that inflammation can affect any and all of our organs, such as the brain and spinal cord with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, the thyroid, the lungs with allergies, asthma, the liver with chronic hepatitis, the kidneys with chronic kidney disease, the skin, the immune system, the eyes with macular degeneration, the heart and blood vessels with atherosclerosis, the pancreas, the digestive system, and the joints. As I said, this gentleman is looking unusually happy. This is probably more like how we feel with inflammation. And the causes of inflammation are many, as I've described before, but the causes of chronic inflammation can include diabetes, obesity, stress, infection, and injury. And all of these can contribute to these other kinds of inflammation, such as atherosclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease, etc. And of course, stress can cause inflammation. This is an example of my my broken wrist, which was one of the causes of the postponement of this presentation, and my broken computer, which was the second cause of the postponement of this presentation. So how can we control inflammation? Well, there are many ways that we can control inflammation. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories such as aspirin, Motrin, etc. Steroids such as prednisone. Disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs such as dexamethasone and cyclophosphamide. Antivirals such as Paxlovid and interferon. Anti-cytokine therapy, which I'll tell you about in a minute with anti-TNF, and lifestyle changes, such as everything that we should be indulging into to have a healthy body, that is sleep, no smoking, meditation, and there are certain diets that are said to be anti-inflammatory. But we have to think about all of these methods to control inflammation as kind of a double-edged sword. That is, remember, inflammation can be beneficial. We want to be able to respond to those insults, such as bacteria and viruses. So we have to be very careful that we don't become completely immunosuppressed by using some of these methods to control inflammation. So one method to control inflammation, and this has been used now in rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, psoriatic arthritis, and several other autoimmune diseases, are antibodies against cytokines. And one set of regulators against cytokines are TNF inhibitors. Remember, I said that TNF was a major cause of inflammation. So if you have a lot of TNF in your joint, with rheumatoid arthritis, you want to get rid of that. And you can do that. Remember, this is what what a hand looks like with rheumatoid arthritis, with these little nodules that are very painful. If an individual is treated with an anti-TNF antibody, that is something that is inhibiting the cytokine, it reduces some of these symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. So on the left-hand side, we see individuals treated with a placebo, that is a non-specific thing. And if we look at the pain score over the course of 4 weeks, it's still very high. However, if they're treated with the anti-TNF antibody, the pain score goes down. And if we count the swollen joints under the placebo, there are up to 30 swollen joints over the course of this treatment. Whereas if you treat with the antibody, the number of swollen joints goes way, way down. And these were some of the first trials of these TNF inhibitors, and they've continued to be quite effective. And in fact, they not only reduce the number of swollen joints, they reverse some of the bone damage. So as I said, these anti-TNF antibodies are used in many autoimmune diseases, and they're antibodies to many different cytokines that are on the market now, and you probably see them advertised on television. And when they advertise them on television, they tell you of the many side effects. So these are not perfect because they result in a generalized immunosuppression. So you're much more susceptible to bacterial, fungal, and viral and kind of atypical infections. There's also danger of reactivation of latent tuberculosis. So the bacteria that cause tuberculosis can be kind of encapsulated and silent. And if our immune response is inhibited with these anti-cytokine therapies or with things like prednisone, tuberculosis can become active again. And again, we're much more susceptible to malignancies, to cancer, because remember, our immune system is very important in reacting against cancer. So there are also foods that fight inflammation. And I'll say right away that I am not an expert on anti-inflammatory diets, but there is a quite an informative monograph that is available. You see the website on the bottom here from Harvard. This costs $18, and unfortunately there are copyright laws that prevent me from just distributing this to all of you, but it's actually quite a useful monograph. So if you're really interested in finding out about foods that fight inflammation, you might want to peruse this. So these are some of the foods that fight inflammation. That is, they are anti-inflammatory. They include tomatoes, fruits, especially blueberries, actually, nuts, fatty fish such as salmon, leafy greens, and olive oil, which is actually quite an important anti-inflammatory food. Foods that cause inflammation are the foods that you get at McDonald's, such as French fried potatoes, sodas, lard, processed meats. So how to make sense of all of this? Well, there are two diets that are considered anti-inflammatory diets. One of them is the Mediterranean diet, shown here on the left, which is high in beans, fatty fish such as salmon, fruits, nuts and seeds, olive oil, wine, So and particularly red wine for all of you who might enjoy a glass of wine at dinner, spices and herbs, vegetables, and as I mentioned, fatty fish. There's another diet which is called the DASH diet, and that also includes fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, fish. That DASH diet includes moderate to low fat diet, dairy, poultry, and meat, and it limits saturated fats and sugars. So both of these are limiting fats and sugars. And so this is a portrait of an anti-inflammatory diet. So it isn't that you're limited like in Weight Watchers or something like that. There's a variety of foods that are included, but they're low in refined foods, high in nutrient-rich foods, and they include sources of omega-3 fats such as olive oil and avocados. They also include coffee and tea, and again, chocolate. Dark chocolate is supposed to be anti-inflammatory. So there are lots of good things in these diets. But what's the scientific basis of these pro and anti-inflammatory diets? There's something called a diet inflammatory index. That's a scoring system for inflammatory foods. So there have been a number of epidemiological studies, and one of them shows that people with a high diet inflammatory index are 32% at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. It's known that berries, particularly blueberries, have antioxidants, and these are anti-inflammatory. And there have been studies that show that there's reduced level of cytokines after ingesting berries. There's a study of 35,000 women who ate a lot of apples, and they were at lower risk of heart disease. And there have been animal studies that show that there's reduced gut inflammation with the apple and increase in beneficial microbes. We haven't talked a lot about beneficial microbes, but all of us in our gut and throughout our body have a population that's called the microbiome, which are microbes that actually are helpful. And so it's very important to have a balance of these beneficial microbes. And it turns out that these animal studies where the animals were given lots of apples had an increase in beneficial microbes. There was a study in 2018 that found that there were lower levels of C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation, in individuals who ate a lot of whole grains compared to individuals who did not eat a lot of whole grains. So there are many epidemiological studies evaluating different foods, but we have to be very careful to watch out for the anti-inflammation diet hype. So I've told you that certain foods may have the ability to suppress inflammation. But how much are you supposed to eat of these things? How many blueberries are you supposed to inject? How often? And what are the specific benefits? If you do a Google search for anti-inflammatory foods, you come up with 635 million results. And I did this the other day, and there may be even more by today. And Amazon lists 10,000 book titles on anti-inflammatory diets. And as I've mentioned, some of these so-called experts will recommend everything from coconut oil to detox cleanses, and there's no research to support these suggestions. So I would say you should just take a common sense approach to foods we know that are good for us. And these would include whole grains, beans, fish, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, etc., and even coffee and tea. So I think the bottom line here is to eat healthy, avoid McDonald's as much as you can, and make sure that you have a balance, that you don't overdo some of these anti-inflammatory things. So in conclusion, I would say inflammation is our friend and our foe. I've pointed out that inflammation fights infection. It's crucial for generating an immune response to cancer. Immune response to vaccines. It's crucial in how we can defend ourselves against cancer. It's a foe when it becomes out of control. So a bacterial infection that gets into our bloodstream, such as sepsis, can be fatal. The cytokine storm in COVID, inflammation and allergy, and autoimmunity when we are reacting against our own self proteins, and systemic chronic inflammation, such as atherosclerosis. I've told you about the mechanisms, which is cells and cytokines, and I've mentioned many kinds of induction mechanisms, such as infection, injury, obesity, stress. And there are many ways to control inflammation. But remember, you need to respond your ability to respond to infection. So I'm delighted to take any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Would you unshare so that we can see the group? And right away, we have 2 questions in the chat. I suggest everyone change your view to gallery, then you can see everybody. And we have 29 screens here. So the first question in the chat comes from Kerry, and he wants to know if you would address asthma and inflammation.
Okay. So yes, so asthma is a manifestation of inflammation, and it can be caused by things like an autoimmune disease, like an allergy. I mean, it can be caused by an allergy, but it can also be caused by kind of chronic response to things like dust and pollen. And what happens in asthma frequently is the lung becomes actually damaged. And so one responds much more rapidly to what would initially have been an insult. So it's kind of a learned response to, and there's so much damage that we respond much more rapidly to the original insult, such as dust or pollen. So it can be due to an allergy, but it can also be due to lung damage through, say, a viral infection.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Trish, and she says, you mentioned pulses under the DASH diet protein sources. She wants to know, what are pulses?
Pulses? Did I mention that? Oh boy, I think that those I'm not sure exactly what a pulse is. I'll have to look that up.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Do people want to just you could wave your hand, although I might not see everybody because I only get 25 screens.
I see a hand. Jean Spencer.
Jean, please unmute. Jean, please unmute. She's doing it.
She's still muted.
I know, I can see that. Okay. Jean, you're still muted. While you're figuring that out, let's see if we have another question. Oh, Jean, good.
Okay, now I could be, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. My question was just, having discussed the diets that are supposed to be good, to reduce inflammation. Are there any common foods that you should avoid in
Uh,
order to,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
did,
besides McDonald's, just, are
yeah.
there any?
Yeah, I did mention that. Fried foods, processed foods such as bologna, liverwurst, anything, anything that's not that's kind of unnatural, I would say, tend to
Okay,
be inflammatory.
okay.
By McDonald's, I meant, lots of greasy hamburgers, um, I think
Totally processed.
totally processed. Yeah. White bread is considered inflammatory. Or I would say whole grain bread would be more anti-inflammatory.
Thank you.
Judith?
I'm just looking up pulses, Nancy.
Thank you.
Pulses are the seeds in plants. So when a legume or a
Okay.
plant is a dry grain, can be called a pulse.
Okay. Thank you.
Don't ask me for examples. I haven't gotten that far yet.
Pumpkin
But,
seeds. Pumpkin seeds.
Yeah, sure.
Pumpkin seeds. Okay. I'll
Good.
remember that.
Okay,
Sorry.
Trish, we're on.
Sorry for that omission.
Okay, Jim Barnes?
And Nancy, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned tertiary lymphoid structures
Mhm.
and how they combat against gliomas. And my question is, my understanding of gliomas is they're so serious, and over 1 million years of evolution, it doesn't seem like tertiary lymphoid structures have made much progress in defeating gliomas.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, that's true. But I actually just returned from a conference in Canada, which is where I got COVID. And
Mm.
the whole concentration of that conference was on ways to encourage tertiary lymphoid structures in cancer. And what is shown is that in some of these what are called immune checkpoint inhibitors, that the tumor responds much better if there are tertiary lymphoid structures. So you're right, the presence of a tertiary lymphoid structure by itself in a glioma is not enough. But there was a very interesting presentation, and I admit that this was in animal models of gliomas, where the group was able to encourage tertiary lymphoid structures and to show quite a beneficial response. So thank you. I didn't mean to say that this was already proven. I should have pointed out that this is research.
Thank you. Harriet?
Hi, this was great. I get the Harvard newsletter, and the Harvard newsletter is always telling me what to eat. And we, in fact, do eat the way that the Harvard newsletter would like us to. But the faint implication in what they say that you could test for this, there's no testing for any of this, is there? I mean, as far
Well, you can test for C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. You can't, I don't think that that's usually within, the panel that most physicians prescribe, but you can do that. You can also test for levels of cytokines, but these are generally in trials where people, I mentioned some of them. As I said, it's very, I am in a school of public health, so I certainly believe epidemiological research, but it's very, very difficult when we are bombarded with many other things that can cause inflammation to pretend that we are in a little black box eating lots of blueberries and reducing our C-reactive protein. So I think that many of these studies depend on very, very large cohorts of people. And you have to remember, and I mean, this is kind of a diversion, but we have to remember that our immune response is based on many, many factors, and these include a genetic propensity to respond to certain things and not other things, gender, hormones, where we live, our microbiome, etc. So I think it's very, very difficult to say, yes, this anti-inflammatory diet is going to cure my cardiovascular disease. But I think it wouldn't hurt to eat in a healthy way. I'm probably preaching to the choir here because many of us are, are ingesting healthy diets. I must say that I'm not maybe one of the prime examples of this, but do what I say, not what I do.
Okay, good.
Uh,
Thank you.
Okay, who else? Who else has a question? Kay?
Yes, thank you for this talk. It was so informative. I'm wondering if there are any studies on inflammation and age.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Apart from all of the insults, as you called them, that happen just because of wear and tear. What is the overall chronological view of inflammation?
okay, that's a wonderful question. And there's a whole field that's called inflammaging. Inflammation and aging, inflammaging. And in fact, there's a conference that's going on right now, or I think it was yesterday at the Lawn Club, where experts from around the world came and talked about inflammation and aging, which unfortunately I wasn't able to attend. And a lot of it actually, and I'm actually a co-author, a very minor co-author on a paper that has to do with obesity and fat in aging. And it turns out that there are cells the fat cells, they're called adipocytes, that as they accumulate, produce a lot of the cytokines that I told you about, things like TNF and IL-1 that cause inflammation. So yes, aging is a major part of inflammation. And people are trying to understand that and, haven't gotten terribly far. But I mean, I shouldn't say that. They've gotten pretty far. And there is, as I say, a whole field on inflammation and aging. And a lot of that has to do, remember I talked in one of the early slides about danger signals. A lot of these danger signals we seem to be a little bit more responsive to as we age and cause a lot more inflammation. And that's considered to be part of this effects in cardiovascular disease.
So it sounds inevitable.
Well, well, maybe. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Trish?
Conceivably, would the low dose aspirin be a way for us inflammaging folks to fight back?
Yeah. Yeah, certainly that is part of that.
Any more questions? Jim?
Well, thank you for letting me ask a second question. I apologize.
No, I liked your first question. Thank you.
Well, this is a little personal. 35 years ago, my father was diagnosed with heart disease, and my mother got a book for him, and I think I have the book up on an out of the way bookshelf on the third floor. I can't remember the doctor's name, but it was called Reversing Heart Disease.
Mm,
Just wondering if you think there's any validity to one being able to reverse or, mitigate heart disease.
I am not an expert on heart disease, so I really can't answer that. I'd
Alright.
have to be very careful about that. I'd like to read the book.
Maybe we can arrange that.
Yeah.
I'll go up to the third floor and look for the book, and I'll email you the author's name.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
If you think of any other questions, feel free to email me.
Nancy, is your email nancy.ruddle@yale.edu?
Yep,
Okay, so it's nancy.ruddle, RUDDLE, @yale.edu. Thank you so much. Thank you. Not only are
Yes,
you an
thank you.
extraordinary expert, Nancy, but your ability to convey the information in a way that we can understand it, very clear, very, you're a wonderful teacher.
thank you,
Thank you
thank you.
so much.